All right, everybody, welcome to today's show. I've got an incredible guest, somebody I'm really excited about having on today, my friend and partner, Simon Lynch. Simon, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Donnie. I'm quite looking forward to it, although it's quite an unusual feeling to be on this side of the camera and getting questions asked rather than asking the question. So I'm a little bit nervous at the same time.
Well, you can't mess up. You can't mess up because we're live right now. Okay, there's no redos on this one.
Just go easy on me.
Yeah, I will. So before we get started into the good juicy stuff here, Simon, why don't you share with everybody listening, what part of the world are you from?
So I live in Sydney, down a long way away from you, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Lived in Sydney. I grew up south of here, but I've lived in Sydney for about probably 15, maybe 17 years now.
Awesome. And you have a family out there in Sydney too, right? Young family?
Yeah, I've got 3 young kids. So I've got a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 5-year-old. So girl, boy. And they certainly keep us busy, but it's a fun journey at the same time. And to some degree, the reason I'm where I am today is that once I had the kids, I wanted something that was more flexible. So I was always planning on starting my own business. And recruitment's one of those things that, if you're good at what you do, it allows you to do that. And for me, the kids was a really key part of that journey and wanting to go and do my own thing.
Right.
Have flexibility and be around, and not that you can't get flexibility elsewhere, but this is having your own business, I guess, is the ultimate flexibility.
Right. Absolutely. What are some of the biggest differences that you've noticed from Australia to now? I know you're trying to kind of tap into the United States market. What are some of the key differences you see there?
From what I can see, I would say the Australian market is a lot more relationship based. It's about who you know, and I know that's the same for every market. But the reason I'd say it's different in Australia is it's a much smaller market in Australia. Like we're only 24 million people. And in the markets that I operate, that it really only occurs in sort of 2 main cities. One's 5 million people and the other's 4.5 million people. So, really you're talking a much smaller market than you in the US are used to dealing with. And so it just really condenses all of those relationships a little bit more. And Aussies are pretty laid back. We're a lot more about relating to someone and then wanting to buy from them. And then if I translate that into the US, you're just a huge market. It's massive. It's mind-blowing for a little Aussie like me to try and get my head around your market. But with 350 million people or whatever it is, I find you have a lot more big companies. So you go and deal with some of the big tech companies like are around you, and like a PayPal or these guys, they're just massive global businesses. And on the back of that, because they're so global and they're so large, they've got a lot more processes in place. So from a recruitment perspective, what that really means is, your client who wants to deal with you may not be able to, because they've got to go through a procurement process, they've got to go through an HR process. And as much as they would like to work outside of that and work with the person that they want to work with, if everyone in the company did that, it wouldn't work. So I would just say your size and scale dictates that process is more of an important thing than relationships. Obviously, you can work around that, and that's what we're trying to do.
Right.
And that certainly does work. But if you're taking an overarching view of the 2 markets, it's just size and scale dictates process over relationships.
Right. So a little bit faster moving over there then too, as a result of that.
Yeah, people can move. Yeah, people can get stuff done a lot quicker. Particularly, like my business, I've been going now for, I think this is my 8th year. And I'm in a really niche down area. So I kind of know everyone. So, from my perspective, that just means I can turn stuff around really, really quickly. And that means, like, if it was like the US where it was process orientated, I can be shortlisted with a client before they've even really put an ad out from their internal recruitment team. So you kind of take the internal process piece out because you deliver way quicker than what they can.
Got it. So interviewing Simon Lynch here, if you're just joining on right now. If you're here, give us a like, comment, and definitely have your questions ready for podcast. Simon's going to be able to answer some questions around his success with podcasts. We're going to talk about that here soon. But Simon, before we get into that, how did you even start in the recruiting business?
Look, I started life as an accountant, and I kind of fell into that because all my mates did it. I went through uni, had a great time at uni. All of the jobs at the end of that were in accounting with the big four firms for graduates. They were the big grad programs when I came through, and all my mates did it. So I just went through that process. From day one as an accountant, I just did. It wasn't me. I'm a sales guy. I'm a people person. And for me, doing technical accounting just wasn't my world. And that showed in my reviews. I basically, every time they were like, Simon, you're great with the clients, but you just need to focus on your technical because you're not very strong there. So I pretty quickly realized not my game. And I actually went to a large international recruiter and said, look, this is what my strengths are. This is what my weaknesses are. I don't really know what I wanted to do. And I ended up working in recruitment for them. They obviously brought up, well, why don't you do recruitment? And that was, I don't know, maybe 22, maybe 23 years ago now, and I've just never looked back. The minute I fell into the recruitment job, I loved it. I stayed with that same firm for about 12 years, traveled the world with them, and then basically got to the point that I wanted to have a family, and that was when the whole thing of doing my own business came up, and that was about 8 years ago now. So really fell into recruitment. I'm sure like most of the people you speak to in recruitment.
Yep.
But I fell on my feet. The minute I was there, I knew I was home and absolutely loved the job. Got it.
So, not just something you got to do, but now it's something you're actually passionate about doing.
Yeah, look, Donnie, I love what I do. I maybe I'm a bit of a recruitment nerd or something. I'm not sure, but I get to do this all day, every day, right? I talk to people, and a friend of my wife said the other day, I could talk underwater, and she's probably not far wrong. So if I get to do what I love doing and chat to people and get to understand people and, dare I say, help people, not that many in recruitment would say you help people, you probably reject more people than you help. But it's more that, you're interacting with people, you're forming relationships. That's the bit that drives me. And, I'm sure we'll come to the podcast in time, but that's kind of where the podcast spawned itself for me in its first instance. Is I was chatting to one of my customers, and I get to have these amazing conversations with really senior people all the time. And we were at a networking event, and all the people he wanted to talk to were on the other side of the room. And he sort of said, well, I want to be over there talking to them, but they don't want to talk to me. And so I kind of said, well, I talk to those guys all the time. What do you want to know? And that conversation over the next half hour made me think, well, I'll just record the conversations I have and put them out into the greater world, on social or whatever platform you decide. If these people are all saying that they want to hear that and I'm having the conversation, I'll just record them. And then I started to think that through, which, 3 years ago, it seems pretty crazy now, but 3 years ago, podcasting certainly wasn't a part of my world. I hadn't listened to a podcast. I didn't really know much about podcasting, but went through the research to understand how am I best to get this information out there, and podcasting was where I ended up. So it was kind of a twofold. One was to get content and information to share within my community, and I'd been thinking about a few other ways or other mediums for me to connect with in the same situation as my customer had there. I wanted to be dealing with a different level of person to get the top jobs in what I do. So, I'm in the Treasury space. I wanted to be dealing with CFOs, but there's no real reason for me to have conversations with CFOs. And I wanted a reason to have that conversation. So doing a podcast was a reason to do that. So it was kind of from a business development perspective that led me down that path as well. And there's so many other benefits I can talk about, that I've found since doing them. But it was probably those two key things that I was thinking of that merged, that made me think a podcast was the way that I could get that information that I needed and wanted to do.
Yeah, and just kind of go on to that a little bit more within the podcast, because I know, a lot of what you and I work on and what, I work with my clients on and here in the Lead Mastery group is looking for more creative ways to do business development. Can you share a little bit more about how, just having the podcast, how that's made business development maybe a little bit easier for you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, having a podcast, and I'll state, having a podcast that's relevant. Like you've got to have content that people want, because it's anyone can have a podcast, but if you don't have many listeners, it's kind of a pointless exercise, really. So you've got to find something that your customers or your target audience really want. And I was fortunate that within the Treasury space, there was no one who was doing anything around this. There was no easy information to be shared. My angle is very much around people's careers. So my customers were all saying to me that they wanted to know, for instance, they wanted to talk to the treasurer to understand how he got to where he was. So my angle in everything that I started doing on the podcast was around, let's tell the story of people's careers. Everyone loves to hear about other people. My job on a daily basis was to ask people about their careers and about what they wanted next. So I wasn't doing anything that was any different, but I was just recording it and putting it out there for others to consume. So, from that perspective, it's about having something that's relevant. And once you've got content that's relevant, then, a podcast effectively is your business development. So, it's twofold really, in that the guests that you want, you can go for aspirational guests. It's a reason to call them. They generally will do it because they've got an ulterior motive as well. But that allows you to have a connection. You're then backwards and forwards with those people. You then release. There's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of touch points to have with those customers, so to speak, or clients, if you will. And you're also then seen as an authority in what you do, because either the people that you are podcasting with, or the people that are listening and see the people that you're podcasting with, see you as the authority in what you do. So it's quite an easy way to get brand awareness, almost by default, because you give something to the community. And that's the whole purpose of my podcast. I'm not podcasting to monetize. I'm not podcasting for any other reason other than, the original thought process, which was to give back, to help my community. But the side benefit of that is it actually helps my business, because it is the business development tool. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And I think that's a huge point that what you just made there at the end is, so many, when we're starting to go put ourselves out there, right? There's a lot of different things. And obviously it takes you time, energy, and effort to do the podcast. And so sometimes when we show up and we're expecting a monetary result from an effort like that, it usually kind of works opposite for us. We're not going to get the monetary result. But when you come into the podcast, like you're saying, and just trying to add goodwill essentially to the marketplace and be a value add, then all the things you talked about happen, where you get business development, you build an authority type of brand, and you drive tons of revenue from it. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
And I think you need to go into it, Donnie, with a view that you're not trying to monetize it. So you've got to look to your audience and say, okay, what does my audience want? I'll produce what my audience wants. Mm-hmm. And if you do that really, really well, the rest of it follows. Right. If you go into it with the wrong mindset of, okay, I'm going to monetize this straight away, I just don't think the product that you're going to produce is going to be what the audience wants, because you're trying to do it for yourself.
Yep.
So that would probably be my big advice to anyone thinking about doing a podcast: is listen to your audience and then do what the audience wants to hear. The rest looks after itself if you get that bit right.
Yep.
It's got to be content and value. I mean, I'm a massive Gary Vee fan, as you know. It's about creating value, and then it's the content that's valuable. People want to consume. We want more content than ever before. So if you can just produce something that people want, then they will come.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I just want to kind of talk about is, you look at so many people. For you, it was a natural, right? Because you're positioned, you're already focused in a market of treasury. And when people go and create podcasts, one of the things that holds them back is they don't have, just like it holds them back with business development, it really is all the same. When you don't know exactly who your audience is, you're not going to see the traction that you want. And I'm sure that's been just a massive part of your success, is that you're doing something that you're already living and breathing every single day. This isn't anything outside of your, you don't have to reset anything. It's probably very easy for you to be able to execute on.
Absolutely, Don. I mean, and that's kind of different to the podcast. Like I'm a massive fan in niche down as much as you can to be relevant. Like I looked at when I was going to start my business in my recruitment business, I was kind of looking at things going, okay, well, I'm looking at these, I'd come out of general finance recruitment and it was a race to the bottom on price. And so I was looking at it going, well, if I want to be relevant in 20 years time and have my own business that's relevant, what do I need to do? And as I was looking at it, it's like, well, I just need to niche this down. Like at the time, like 8 years ago, it was kind of illogical. Everyone was saying, no, go broad finance. And I thought, well, if I go broad finance, you're one of 100. If I go treasury, which no one was doing, or, if you go to other parts of the world, very few people are doing, then you're relevant. Like straight away, you can own a market, you can own the knowledge base and really be 100% relevant to everyone who's in that market versus not really that relevant to lots and lots of people. So yeah, to me, niching down in recruitment is the way forward. The more niche you can get, I think the more successful you will be, which is kind of counterintuitive because you're going to less and less people. But I mean, that sort of lends itself to why I'm working with you and why we're going into the US now is I did that in Australia. That was really successful. Everyone said I was crazy, that there was no work there. 8 years on, I've got a thriving business, which is fabulous. That then led me to Singapore and Hong Kong because I had clients who in Australia said, well, no one does what you do in those markets. Ironically, through Singapore, half of my clients in Singapore were in the US. When I started talking to the people in the US, they're like, well, no, there's no one who does what you do in the US. And so you can see by niching down, you're sort of thinking to yourself, well, I'm only relevant to 2,500 people in Sydney. And then you go, well, hang on a second, that niche and that specialization is probably 20,000 people across Australia, Asia, and the US. So all of a sudden, what you've actually done is created a massive business, but it's just really, really narrow in what you focus on. So that I can't talk highly enough about niching down, despite it being counterintuitive to those who haven't done it before.
Yep. I know there's a lot of resistance around that. I speak with recruiters every day about that, and there's always a level of fear. And I think it is that scarcity thing, right? Because you're going to less, but when you're the most relevant person to this, it's a hell of a lot easier to be more relevant to a small market than it is to the masses, right?
100%.
And the podcast is case in point.
And like the best example I'll give you is like in Australia, I'm the only guy that does treasury. I've done it for 8 years. So, you look at that and say, how tight are those relationships? For someone to enter the treasury market in Australia now, it'd be virtually impossible because like I just own that market. And it's really bizarre to think that people wouldn't want to do that. Why would you not want to own something when you can actually be, if you're one of 10 in another market, you're just driven by price. Like there's one of the other 9 guys is going to undercut you on price.
Mm-hmm.
Go somewhere where you can be more relevant and super honed in.
Yeah. Talk to us about the podcast from a candidate perspective. Like how has that impacted? Have you been able to kind of, you talked about business development, but have you seen a direct correlation from, candidates and what the podcast and how it's actually affecting your business?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, from a candidate perspective, it's very much the benefit is branding and authority. Mm-hmm. So I've probably seen it more so. Well, the junior end of the market, is where a lot of this was targeted at to start with because they want to hear the story. So they consume the content like no one else. Like they love it because they don't have access to a treasurer or
mm-hmm.
a senior person that readily. So from a from their perspective, they are a huge proportion of the consumers of the podcast. But if I relate that into starting in the US and going into a new market, what it's really allowed is in a very short period of time, people know who you are. So, the funny story I can probably tell you from a US perspective is I was out there for my second trip and I met with a lady who'd been on the podcast, and she said to me, Simon, could I just ask you, like, how do you actually make money as a podcaster? And I had to laugh and say to her, Helen, look, I actually have a recruitment business. I just haven't dropped that out in the American marketplace yet. So what actually happened was, again, relating it back to your candidate question, For about 6 months, people in the US were seeing the podcast and they had no idea, it was the Treasury Talent Podcast, but they didn't know Treasury Talent. But over that 6-month period, they got to learn the brand and understand that I knew Treasury and understand that I knew a lot of treasurers. And then really it was as simple as just actually putting it out there to say, and by the way, guys, Treasury Talent is a recruitment business. So if you want your next job, come and chat to us because we're specialists in Treasury Talent. So there was a lot of, brand awareness and knowledge of what we knew and how good we were in that space before they knew that we were a recruitment business.
Got it. Yeah. Now, what would you say, if a lot of people that are listening right now are probably curious of, maybe they've thought about starting a podcast and have some fears coming up, but when it comes to like the traction and you being able to see, again, you didn't start it with a monetary ROI involved and it is the driving motivation. And I still know that's not it, but it has produced that. And how long did you kind of see that the podcast was not even necessarily from a revenue standpoint, but just from a branding standpoint? Like how long did it take you to get some traction?
I mean, I've been doing the podcast now for 2 years. So if you had have asked me this question after 3 months, I would have said immediately. Mm-hmm. If you had have asked me this question after 6 months, I would have said, yeah, definitively, like really, really quickly it got traction. But if I look at where it is now, I'd say it probably took 6 months. You're getting listeners. I had some great social media and that really produced a lot of awareness around the podcast right from day one. And so, if I look at it from a listener's perspective, it's gone from about 200 listeners in that first 6 months per week, to 800 listeners a week now. So it's probably 4 times bigger, and that just happens over time as more people learn about it. But I was still pretty happy getting, sort of 200 listeners a week when we started. When you consider that, my market is probably the target audience is maybe only about 20,000. So I was quite happy with that traction. But yeah, in hindsight, as I look back, it really kicked off after about 6 months, because by then you've got a track record. People have seen it, they've trusted it, and people don't listen to it every week, right? So I find even the podcasts that I produced 2 years ago, they still probably get like 20 to 30 listens a month, even though they're really, they're quite dated. So yeah, I would say you've got to allow a bit of time and make sure, again, I just come back to make sure the offering is what people want. Mm-hmm. Pick that up within the first month or two. And you can always pivot on that to find out what people do want and make sure it is relevant. But you'll start to see the listeners, and then you really start to see it climb. Yep.
Good advice. Because I know that's going to be something that people, a good expectation to have, that it just takes time and you have to buy into it from with the long-term approach.
And I think you've also got, like, you really need to make a commitment to doing it regularly, whatever your frequency is, you've just got to make sure that you turn up. And I think that I started off with the aim of doing one a week, which I thought at the time was actually going to be really, really challenging to do. I now do 2 a week. I don't find it that hard to get guests anymore, which again, when you're starting a podcast, I would say, make sure you target the right people. If you get aspirational people that people want to listen to, that's far more important than just producing a podcast. I was really very focused in my early days on making sure I got big brands that people were going to be attracted to with a global audience. So I targeted businesses like Visa Incorporated, Uber, Palo Alto Networks, like big businesses that people were going to go, wow, like, how does this guy talk to these people? And if he talks to them, I should be talking to him too.
Yeah, that's smart. That's brilliant. Now, I mean, kind of the result that everybody wants to hear about from the podcast is, the revenue driving. And I know we've never talked necessarily specifics, but I know it's always hard to quantify how much comes from that. But in the past, you mentioned that once you kind of started the podcast, it essentially doubled your business, almost doubled the following year. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So my business, from when I started the podcast to today, the business has doubled. So technically I've been doing it for 2 years. So, if you look at revenue, and at that point in time, I had a business that had been going 5-6 years. So I had a reasonable business before, but it's basically doubled in the 2 years preceding, and that's really before, Donnie, we even factor in the US. Obviously,
right.
The US market we've only kicked off really September last year, and it's sort of starting to get that up and going. I look at my Australian business or my Asian business versus the US. That market's 20 times what my business is over here. So we're just getting started there. That's probably a better question to ask in 2 more years to see what's happened in the US. And that's the other, important thing to talk about there is that's a very different model that we're looking at, because that was starting a business from scratch.
Right.
I had no clients, no customer base, no presence in the US. And I really leveraged the podcast to be that branding and understanding in the market of who we were. And so the proof will be in the pudding as to what we can deliver in 2020 and then into 2021 around that whole US business. And I think, based on what I'm seeing at the moment and based on what I've seen with the Australian business, it will be, I'll be surprised if it's not 10 times, it's amazing how powerful it is. But you've got to get your content right, and you've got to get, your audience right.
Right. I mean, you've dropped a ton of value around the podcast. If you were to kind of sub up like one thing, one piece of advice that you would give somebody that's thinking about starting a podcast, I mean, what would that be?
Do it. Just, again, assuming you know what you want to do. If you've got an audience that is saying to you, this is what we want, then just do it. I mean, ironically, I spoke to a mate yesterday who's in the agriculture field, and we're having this exact same conversation. And as we talked through it, he said, well, look, this is my idea and this is what I do. And, part of my podcast really came from the fact that I have the same conversations every day. You talk about the same things every week. Mm-hmm. So all you're really doing in a podcast, even if you just take it in its very basic form, is if you just put content out there that is the content you talk about every week, and you make a podcast about that, it then lives 24/7. Yep. So even if you're not having guests on your podcast, if you're just putting your content out there and saying, I'll give you, for me, what the most asked question I get in my job is salaries. Am I getting paid enough? What's the market for salaries? So I produced a podcast on salaries in Treasury. That's my most listened to podcast, not one that I had a guest on. My second most listened podcast is career development in Treasury. So just talking about how do you develop your career? What's my advice? What do I see? So all that I really was doing is the conversation I have with candidates all day, every day. I just recorded that on a podcast and put it out there with all of my other interviews. So they're my 2 most listened to podcasts, not even my guests. So you can do it without, it doesn't have to be a guest. Mm-hmm. You're almost like a library type scenario would work as well. So I would just say, don't procrastinate on it, just do it and find the niche that works the best for you to get whatever it is you want out into the wide world.
Love that advice. We've obviously done some work together over the last, couple months. It's been a lot of fun. But what are some of the things that you think have been the most impactful from the work that we've been doing together, around the podcast and then the business in general?
So look, the thing that you do that really attracted me was all around the automation and the social media. So I'm very good at the talking. I'm very good at the relationship piece, but there's only one of me. And when I wanted to go to the US and I saw that opportunity, 3 years ago, I thought to myself, how am I going to do this? Like I can't be in 2 places at one time, and my wife will divorce me if I leave. As appealing as that might be sometimes, but I can't be in 2 places at one time. So I'm going to have to automate, and I'm going to have to really use social media in a smarter way than what I've ever done before, to get the brand out there and to be relevant in other locations. So, that's not my world. I have no concept at all around. In fact, even if you look at my LinkedIn 2 years ago, I didn't even post on LinkedIn. I used LinkedIn purely as a scraping mechanism in order to be within the Treasury community, but I didn't even engage with that community. So I was a long way behind the 8 ball on what can be done in social media. And I don't use Facebook, by the way. So my 10-year-old, when she was a baby, I posted a picture. My wife went nuts. I cancelled my Facebook account. So I am literally a social media moron. And I needed someone like you who could explain the big wide world that is social media now. And more importantly, automate so that you can be, again, the great thing about the podcast is it's 24/7. People listen when they want to listen. Likewise, social media. So you can have a business development engine that's working for you 24/7 rather than the business hours that I work. And I think that's really important for listeners as well, because you can get work-life balance in your own business by, you turn on when you want to turn on, but then you have automation and social and everything else going the other 16, 17, 18 hours of the day when you don't want to be working. So right. that's and then obviously, I came to you because you're in America, and my target market that I need more than anything is the US. So, I recognize my weaknesses, and I don't know the US market. So I wanted to go to someone who did, and could really help me to drive all of that side of my business.
Right. Now, I know we've implemented some, multi-channel, marketing things where we've LinkedIn, we've got business Facebook and email. Would you share with everyone, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about that when you send somebody that email that we sent out, and then they also responded to that email saying how they've seen you and stuff like that, and just give people the idea of how powerful that multi-channel marketing can be.
Yeah, for sure. So it was actually a client that I'd met in California who was really frosty. We came out of the meeting and my business partner over there said to me, "Wow, that guy is hard work." And so, as it turned out, we kind of won him over because we delivered a whole lot of options that he hadn't thought of before. So we were starting to come around. I then did a presentation, which again came off all of that stuff that we're doing, where my brand, I got invited to go to a conference. He was at that conference. And then once we implemented the Facebook and the LinkedIn and everything else on the social platform, over the Christmas break, he said he saw My Ugly Melon come up on his phone at least 15 times over the Christmas break. He's like, "I don't know what you're paying these guys, but you're everywhere." So, from a branding perspective, once you go that multi-channel option, rather than for him who's, socially, no doubt over Christmas, not looking at LinkedIn, but he's probably reading his Facebook, he was blown away with the fact that he sees me all the time on LinkedIn, but then all of a sudden over Christmas, what's he doing here? How's he touching me in this place as well? So, it's super powerful from what I've seen in the last few months.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all that. Got a comment here from Janet. It says, "Great information. I initially thought about doing a podcast, but pursued live streaming. I have a weekly live stream on Facebook business page providing career tips for intentional compensation professionals thinking about repurposing into a new podcast this year." Yeah, Janet, definitely do that. That's actually what I do with these here, is I take these live recordings here, record them. It goes into my live stream that we're doing right now on Facebook. I'll take it and upload it to YouTube and take it and upload it to a podcast. So highly recommend. It's just a repurposing of content. And I know, Simon, that's some of the things we're looking on doing with you too, is just getting those your podcast into the video podcast now too.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's classic Gary Vee, right? Isn't it? Take long form content and repurpose it. And you're one step ahead of me because I'm not live streaming my podcast, which I probably should do. But yeah, absolutely. You're just one level up. You record it live. You then put that onto a podcast and then start to slice it and dice it from there, which is, again, super powerful. It's amazing how and the best thing about it is it's not your content, it's not your brain that needs to create it. You're chatting to people about things that they're very knowledgeable about, and then actually can give that to your audience in a different medium of content. So yeah, I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah. Repurposing content, just kind of going down that. I mean, somebody posted, or I saw a little stat earlier around how long a post will stay in an algorithm on social media feeds, and it'll be surprised you how little time you really have in there. And there's so much content that we create, and people tend to overthink, like, well, I've got to continually create, and actually you can repurpose the heck out of it, because 9 times out of 10 things, even though people probably see a hell of a lot of me, they probably don't even see near as much as what I post. Because the algorithms don't work that way. So post.
How long is it? I would say, from what I see in my feed, I reckon you've got a week, maybe 10 days, and then that's where 99% of people will see it, and then occasionally you get a little bit of dribble of views after that. But would that be right? It's about
shorter than that usually. I mean, you've got a pretty decent following, so you get some good trickle through. Most people, like a lot of people listening on working LinkedIn, obviously a lot. LinkedIn, they say it's basically you've got about a 2 to 3 hour window in the beginning of that post to try to get some traction. If it gets traction, it's going to go. But most of your views on LinkedIn are going to come within the first 24 hours.
Right.
In Facebook, it's even a little bit less, and especially if you're doing things through a business page, you're going to get probably very minimal views. Just doesn't work that well anymore. But yeah, the point is though is with people that are trying to create content, is don't be afraid to repurpose and reuse that content in multiple different ways, because chances are somebody didn't see it. And I always sometimes we tend to overthink it, and especially I produce a lot of stuff and put a lot of stuff out there. And then, I can go talk to somebody and they haven't seen, stuff that I think that would be obviously they would see, right? So sometimes we tend to overthink, and, the name of the game is just putting it out there and reusing it. And, that's really what creates the awareness that a lot of people are looking for. What would you say, Simon, as we kind of wrap this thing up? You've mentioned Gary Vee, but who else has been kind of an influencer for you on this journey?
I mean, look, Gary Vee definitely is, like, if I look at my overall strategy, and what attracted me to come and work with you was really around the whole Gary Vee ethos. I'm trying to think of who I keep on coming back to him. I think there's people now like Shay Rowbottom, who's out there, and she puts some interesting stuff out, but she's just using Gary Vee's philosophy. Yeah. Really. Yep. So there's no one else that I can think of who's doing anything different. I think there's people who have been on my journey that use that same philosophy, and that's what I guess I keep coming back to. And I totally believe in that philosophy as well. I think it's a really easy, effective methodology. So yeah, I'd come back. I'd honestly say just stick with Gary.
Yep. So you've got a booming treasury business. You've got a podcast that's continuing to grow, working in the U.S. market now. I mean, what are you most excited about, with the business right now?
I'm super pumped about the US. And I'm super pumped about the US because I've got staff over there now, and, to see how excited they get, and, the conversations that I have with them around, again, my methodology, which is very different to all the other businesses. And, from a staffing perspective, that's the background they've come from. And we're really sort of doing things a little bit differently in that I try and do the relationship piece and the networking and making the business about us owning that market and understanding that market, as opposed to putting an ad out and taking a response. So for them to see that different methodology, and then for them to go, wow, this is actually really exciting. Like, I was jaded by the old process, and you've really reinvigorated me, and I'm super excited about what's to come. That's super exciting. And, just the size of the US market, to be honest, Donnie, like, when you work in a market of, like, my market here's kind of 2,500 people, and then you look at the US as probably 25,000 people. So, to 10 times the audience in itself is super exciting. And then just, this is going to sound terrible to you, US audience, but I actually didn't really know that much about the US before I started the business over there. And it's just super exciting learning about different things. The best example I'll give you is, in my work with you, I thought San Francisco and the general area where you live, and, all of that sort of area, like the 49ers territory, I thought that was all just San Francisco. I didn't realize San Francisco was the little peninsula at the end. And then you've got Silicon Valley and everything in between. And then you've got San Jose. And if you're from San Jose, you're not from San Francisco. And, then you live outside of San Jose. And, like that, to me, it's just mind blowing how big and how many people, I went with you for dinner that night on a Sunday night. We went to your local place. If that was in Sydney, that would be the most humming restaurant that there is. Like I've never seen so many people. So all of that stuff super excites me.
Yeah, that's cool. That's awesome. So if people wanted to reach out and get in touch with you, Simon, what's the best way for them to be able to do that and share your podcast, if you will, too?
Yeah, so the podcast is the Treasury Talent Podcast. So if you go treasurytalent.com/treasury-talent-podcast. So that, effectively you go onto my website and then there's a drop down there on podcasts. So you'll find it there. So you can see all the episodes there. And then the best way to get hold of me would be either through that website or my Australian business has got a different name, so it's a bit confusing. But my email address is simon@daveylynch.com. So it's DAVEYLYNCH.com. So yeah, if you want to get hold of me that way, they're probably the best two mediums, or via LinkedIn, Simon Lynch at Treasury Talent, obviously. So reach out via LinkedIn.
Excellent, guys. Make sure you reach out to Simon if you have any questions and give his podcast a listen. And if you go to his podcast page, you might be surprised just how much you see Simon after that. Simon, I asked the question around the podcast, but I want to ask this just in general of business. There's a lot of people listening here that love to have the success that you've had and start to expand globally and things like that. When it comes to the recruitment business, what's your one piece of advice that you would give everyone?
I think I'll just come back to what we talked about earlier, Donnie, is niche it down. Like the more niched you are, the more relevant you are. And it's counterintuitive because you think you've got less of an audience, but in actual fact, you've got a better audience. So I just think I would prefer to be super relevant to 2,000 people than semi-relevant to 20,000 people. So niche it down, that's 100% what has been my success in my business.
Awesome. It's allowed you to build that relevant brand, huh?
Exactly, Bill. And use Donnie. Get yourself out there so that everyone who goes to my my podcast now, you'll see me everywhere. That's what Donnie does. So definitely chat to Donnie.
Awesome. Please appreciate that little plug there, Simon. Well, thank you everybody that watched today and listened in. Appreciate it, Simon. Thank you for being with me today and sharing all your value and knowledge. I know a lot of people I talk to people almost every day that are interested in the podcast game. And it's nice to talk to somebody who's not only started one, but actually been very successful with the podcast and actually even monetized some things on the podcast. So Janet just said, thank you for all your value, Simon. So, we've got another interview coming up next week. My podcast itself will actually be going live here within the next couple of weeks. So I'll share that with everybody in here as that actually goes live. But until next time, everyone, thank you very much for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.